The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the Denver Emergency Communications Center as Marcus Williams adjusted his headset for what he hoped would be a quiet Tuesday night shift. 23 years of dispatching emergency services had taught him to recognize the rhythm of a city, the usual drunk and disorderly calls, domestic disputes, and occasional medical emergencies that painted the darker side of urban life. But tonight felt different. The calls had started around 9 o'clock, scattered reports of violent attacks in the downtown area that made his experienced instincts prickle with unease. 911, what's your emergency? Marcus answered the incoming call, his fingers already poised over the keyboard to input location data. The voice on the other end was breathless, panicked in a way that cut through his professional calm like a blade. My neighbor, oh God, my neighbor just attacked Mrs. Henderson next door. He bit her face off. There's blood everywhere and he won't stop, he won't listen, he's not human anymore. The caller's voice dissolved into hysterical sobbing before the line went dead. Marcus immediately dispatched units to the Riverside District address, but a cold dread was already settling in his stomach. This was the 7th similar call in the past hour, all from different neighborhoods across the city. 15 miles away, Dr. Rebecca Thompson pushed through the automatic doors of Denver General Hospital's emergency department, her CDC identification badge still swinging from the lanyard around her neck. She had been called in to investigate what hospital administrators were calling an unusual cluster of violent behavioral incidents. As an epidemiologist specializing in emerging infectious diseases, Rebecca had seen her share of outbreaks, but the preliminary reports she'd reviewed during her drive over had left her deeply troubled. Patients were arriving with bite wounds, but not from animals, from other humans. More disturbing still, many of the attackers were previous victims who had been treated and released, only to return hours later in a state of uncontrollable rage. Dr. Thompson, thank God you're here, called Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the chief of emergency medicine, her usually composed demeanor cracked with exhaustion and fear. We've had 37 cases in the last 4 hours. The patients arrive lucid but agitated. Then within 2 to 3 hours they become completely unresponsive to verbal commands and exhibit extreme aggressive behavior. We've had to restrain most of them, but they're showing superhuman strength. 3 of my staff members have been injured trying to contain them. Rebecca followed Dr. Walsh through the chaotic emergency department, noting the increased security presence and the way staff members moved with obvious fear. In the observation area, she could see several patients strapped to gurneys, their eyes vacant and clouded, jaws working constantly as if chewing on something invisible. The sound they made was inhuman, a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from deep within their chests. Their skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and dark veins were visible beneath the surface like ink spreading through water. Has anyone tested for known pathogens? Rebecca asked, pulling on latex gloves as she approached one of the restrained patients. The middle-aged man looked up at her with milky eyes that seemed to track her movement, and when she leaned closer to examine his pupils, he suddenly lunged forward with his teeth bared, the restraints creaking under the force of his struggle. We've run every test in our arsenal, Dr. Walsh replied grimly. Blood work, toxicology, CT scans, lumbar punctures. Everything comes back negative or inconclusive. Whatever this is, it's not in any medical textbook I've ever read. The hospital's PA system crackled to life. Code Gray Emergency Department. Code Gray Emergency Department. The announcement meant hospital security was needed urgently, and Rebecca could hear shouting coming from the direction of the main treatment area. They rushed toward the commotion to find 3 security guards struggling to subdue a patient who had somehow broken free from his restraints. The man moved with jerky, unnatural motions, his arms swinging wildly as he tried to bite anyone within reach. Back at the emergency center, Marcus was fielding calls at a rate he'd never experienced in his career. The computer screen in front of him was filled with pending incidents, each one marked with increasing urgency. Police units were reporting that they couldn't contain the violent individuals, that standard crowd control methods weren't working. Fire departments were responding to multiple structure fires, apparently started by the affected individuals who seemed to have lost all sense of self-preservation. The National Guard had been activated, but even their initial reports suggested they were unprepared for what they were encountering. As the clock struck midnight, both Marcus and Rebecca realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. The scattered incidents were accelerating, spreading outward from the city center like ripples in a pond. Whatever was happening to the people of Denver was contagious, fast-acting, and unlike anything in recorded medical history. The age of the undead had begun, and neither of them knew if humanity would survive to see another dawn. The emergency communications center had descended into complete chaos by dawn. Marcus Williams watched helplessly as his fellow dispatchers abandoned their posts one by one, either fleeing the city or succumbing to the spreading infection themselves. The giant wall display that normally showed organized emergency response units across Denver now looked like a battlefield map, with red warning indicators blinking across every district. Through the reinforced windows, he could see smoke rising from multiple points throughout the city, and the distant sound of automatic gunfire had become a constant background noise. Marcus made the decision that would save his life. He was leaving his post. After 23 years of dedicated service, the city he had sworn to protect was beyond saving. He grabbed the emergency radio from his desk and headed for the parking garage, knowing that his knowledge of Denver's emergency evacuation routes might be the only thing keeping him alive in the hours ahead. The elevator was out of service, so he took the stairs, each floor revealing windows that showed the nightmare unfolding below. Abandoned vehicles clogged the streets, some still running with their doors hanging open, while grotesque figures shambled between them with the unmistakable lurching gait he had heard described in hundreds of panicked 911 calls. Dr. Rebecca Thompson had made her own desperate escape from Denver General Hospital after watching the emergency department become overrun by infected patients who had turned on the medical staff. Her CDC training had taught her to recognize pandemic patterns, but nothing had prepared her for the speed at which this contagion spread. She clutched a hastily assembled sample kit containing blood work from the earliest victims, knowing it might hold the key to understanding what humanity was facing. Her government-issued SUV had four-wheel drive and enough fuel to get her out of the city, but first she needed to link up with other survivors who might have valuable skills for the journey ahead. The meeting point was a 24-hour truck stop on the outskirts of Denver, a location Marcus had designated over the emergency radio frequencies as a rally point for any first responders still alive and coherent. When Rebecca arrived, she found Marcus's patrol car already there, along with a military Humvee and several civilian vehicles. The first person she encountered was Jake Martinez, a Marine Corps sergeant on leave who had been visiting family when the outbreak began. His desert camouflage uniform was torn and blood-stained, but his eyes were sharp and alert, constantly scanning their surroundings for threats. "You military?" Jake asked Rebecca as she approached, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. When she showed him her CDC credentials, his expression shifted to one of urgent interest. "Then you might actually know what we're dealing with. These things, they're not responding to pain, they don't get tired, and they don't stop coming until you destroy the brain. I've seen fellow Marines get torn apart by what used to be their own neighbors." Marcus emerged from the truck stop's convenience store carrying armloads of water bottles and canned goods, accompanied by an elderly Hispanic woman who moved with surprising agility despite her age. "This is Helen Rodriguez," Marcus said, making introductions as more survivors gathered around them. "She's a retired nurse and knows these mountain roads better than anyone. Helen, meet Dr. Thompson from the CDC and Sergeant Martinez." Helen's weathered hands were steady as she distributed medical supplies she had salvaged from an abandoned pharmacy. "I've lived in Colorado for 60 years, she said in a voice that carried the authority of experience. "If we're going to survive this, we need to get up into the mountains where the population density is lower. I know places where we can hole up and figure out our next move, but we need to leave now. The infected are spreading out from the city, and this truck stop won't be safe much longer." As if summoned by her words, a group of shambling figures appeared at the edge of the parking lot, their movement erratic but purposeful as they caught the scent of living humans. Jake immediately took charge, directing the survivors to their vehicles while drawing his sidearm. "Everyone move now. We convoy up the mountain highway, stay close together but don't get boxed in. If your vehicle breaks down, abandon it and jump in with someone else. Nobody gets left behind unless they're already infected." The escape convoy consisted of 5 vehicles carrying 12 survivors total, including 2 children whose parents had been killed in the initial outbreak. Rebecca rode with Marcus in his police cruiser, using the radio equipment to monitor emergency frequencies that were rapidly going silent across the region. Behind them, Jake led the way in the Humvee with Helen as his navigator, while the remaining survivors followed in a mix of civilian cars and trucks loaded with whatever supplies they had managed to gather. The highway out of Denver resembled a scene from the apocalypse. Abandoned vehicles forced them to weave through obstacles while groups of infected wandered aimlessly among the wreckage, drawn by the sound of their engines. Several times they had to stop and clear zombies from their path, Jake and Marcus working together with methodical efficiency to dispatch the creatures with headshots while the others kept watch. Rebecca documented everything she observed, noting that the infected seemed to have lost most cognitive function but retained basic motor skills and an overwhelming drive to seek out living humans. As they climbed higher into the Colorado Rockies, the air grew thin and cold, but the density of infected decreased dramatically. Behind them, the lights of Denver flickered and died as power grids failed and civilization collapsed. Helen guided them to a series of back roads that wound through dense forest, paths that would be nearly impossible for large groups of infected to navigate. For the first time since the outbreak began, the survivors allowed themselves to hope that they might live to see another day. 3 days of driving through winding mountain roads had pushed the convoy to its limits. Gas was running low, food supplies were nearly exhausted, and the constant stress of avoiding infected hordes was taking its toll on everyone's nerves. Helen Rodriguez had guided them through increasingly remote areas of the Colorado wilderness, using old logging roads and hunting trails that most people had forgotten existed. But even her extensive knowledge of the region couldn't conjure fuel from empty tanks or food from barren cupboards. It was Marcus Williams who first spotted the sign through the trees: Aspen Ridge Resort, private property. The wrought iron gates stood open, hanging loosely on their hinges as if someone had left in a hurry. Beyond the entrance, a winding paved road disappeared up the mountainside toward what appeared to be a large lodge structure. Jake Martinez immediately put the convoy on high alert, knowing that any inhabited area could harbor either survivors or infected, and there was no way to tell which until they got close enough to investigate. "This place looks too good to be true," Rebecca Thompson observed from the passenger seat of Marcus's cruiser, studying the manicured landscape through binoculars. The resort had clearly been designed for wealthy clientele: sprawling buildings constructed from local stone and timber, multiple levels carved into the mountainside, and what appeared to be solar panels glinting from several rooftops. If someone picked this as a place to ride out the apocalypse, they chose well. The convoy approached slowly, engines idling quietly as Jake and Marcus performed a preliminary reconnaissance on foot. The main lodge was a massive structure that could easily house 50 people, with a great room featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered commanding views of the valley below. More importantly, there were clear signs that someone had been preparing this place for exactly the kind of situation they now faced. Steel shutters had been installed on all the ground floor windows, the landscaping had been modified to create clear sight lines, and there were obvious defensive positions constructed around the building's perimeter. "Hello, the house," Jake called out, his rifle ready but not quite aimed at the building. "We're survivors from Denver looking for shelter. We have medical personnel and supplies to trade." The response came from an unexpected direction. A hidden speaker mounted in one of the trees crackled to life. "How many of you are there, and have any of you been bitten?" The voice was cultured, educated, with the kind of confidence that suggested its owner was accustomed to being in control of situations. 12 people total, no bites, no infections," Marcus responded, having taken over the negotiation. "We have a CDC doctor with us who's been studying the outbreak. We're not looking for a handout. We can contribute to whatever you've got going here." After several minutes of tense silence, the front doors of the lodge swung open to reveal a well-dressed man in his 50s, flanked by several other survivors who were clearly armed but not immediately threatening. The man stepped forward with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "I'm David Knox, and this is my property. Dr. Rebecca Thompson, I presume? Your reputation preceded you. I've been monitoring emergency frequencies since this whole nightmare began." Knox's story was impressive and somewhat troubling in equal measure. A successful tech entrepreneur who had made his fortune in cybersecurity, he had purchased the resort 3 years earlier and spent considerable resources converting it into what he called a continuity facility. The solar power system could run the entire complex indefinitely, there were multiple backup generators, a sophisticated water filtration system, and food stores that could feed 30 people for 6 months. He had been monitoring global communications networks and had seen the outbreak patterns developing days before they reached Denver. "I've been expecting people like you," Knox said as he led them through a tour of the facilities. "Competent individuals with useful skills who had the intelligence to get out of the cities before complete collapse. This facility was designed to preserve civilization through exactly this kind of crisis, but it requires the right kind of people to make it work." The other survivors already at the resort were an interesting mix. Amy Patterson, 17 years old, had arrived with her 12-year-old brother Tommy after their parents were killed in the early stages of the outbreak. Carl Washington, a mechanic in his 40s, had been working on Knox's vehicle fleet when the crisis began and decided to stay rather than try to reach his family in California. There were also 3 other families who had arrived over the past week: all of them having heard Knox's emergency broadcasts offering sanctuary to qualified survivors. Rebecca immediately began setting up a medical facility in one of the resort's conference rooms, using the supplies they had gathered during their escape from Denver. Her priority was establishing quarantine protocols and continuing her research into the viral pathogen, using the resort's surprisingly well-equipped communications center to try reaching other CDC facilities that might still be operational. Carl proved invaluable in maintaining their vehicles and the resort's mechanical systems, while Helen took charge of organizing food distribution and medical care for the children. Jake was more skeptical of their new situation. His military training made him suspicious of Knox's overly generous hospitality and the man's tendency to speak about the crisis as if it were a business opportunity rather than a human catastrophe. The defensive preparations were impressive, but Jake noticed that most of the weapons and ammunition were kept in Knox's personal control, distributed to others only for specific duties like perimeter patrol. Despite these concerns, the resort offered something none of them had experienced since the outbreak began: genuine safety and the possibility of planning beyond mere survival. For the first time in days, people were able to sleep without keeping one eye open for approaching threats. The children began to show signs of recovering from their trauma, and the adults started to believe they might actually live long enough to see the other side of humanity's darkest hour. Chat controls Sonnet 4. The attack came at dawn on their 10th day at the resort, announced by the most terrifying sound any of them had ever heard: the collective moan of hundreds of infected voices echoing through the mountain valley. Amy Patterson was on morning watch duty when she spotted the first wave cresting the ridge above the main access road, a writhing mass of gray-skinned figures stumbling and crawling down the mountainside with single-minded determination. Her scream of alarm brought everyone running to the windows, where they witnessed a nightmare that defied comprehension. "Jesus Christ, there must be 500 of them," Jake Martinez breathed, his Marine training immediately kicking in as he assessed the tactical situation. The infected were approaching from multiple directions, not just the main road but through the forest on both flanks, moving with a coordination that none of them had observed before. These weren't the scattered individuals they had encountered during their escape from Denver. This was an organized horde, and somehow they had tracked the survivors to their mountain sanctuary. David Knox's face had gone pale as he watched his carefully prepared defenses being tested for the first time. "The perimeter sensors should have given us more warning," he muttered, frantically checking his security monitors. "They must have been moving all night, staying just beyond detection range until they were ready to attack." His composure was cracking, revealing the fear beneath his confident facade, and Jake realized that for all his preparation, Knox had never actually expected to face a threat of this magnitude. Rebecca Thompson was already moving toward her makeshift laboratory, knowing that she needed to secure her research samples before the fighting began. Her work on understanding the viral pathogen could be crucial to humanity's survival, and she couldn't afford to lose it now. "Helen, get the children to the basement shelter," she called out while gathering her most critical data. "Tommy and Amy, help her move the medical supplies down there too." Carl Washington was already running toward the resort's maintenance building, where he had been constructing improvised explosive devices from fertilizer and fuel supplies. His mechanical expertise had proved invaluable in preparing defensive measures, and now those preparations would be put to the ultimate test. "Give me 15 minutes to rig the access road," he shouted to Jake. "I can slow them down, but once those charges blow, we're committed to making our stand here." The first infected reached the resort's outer perimeter just as Carl's explosives detonated, sending a massive fireball into the morning sky and temporarily scattering the approaching horde. The explosion bought them precious time, but it also confirmed their worst fears. The infected barely reacted to the blast, stepping over the bodies of their destroyed companions without hesitation. These creatures felt no fear, no pain, and no self-preservation instinct. Jake took command of the defense, positioning the survivors at strategic points throughout the main lodge. Marcus Williams and 2 other men took the upper floor windows, using hunting rifles to pick off infected at longer range. Helen Rodriguez, despite her age, proved to be an excellent shot with a pistol, covering the main entrance alongside Carl, who wielded a modified nail gun he had converted into a formidable weapon. David Knox, to his credit, overcame his initial panic and took responsibility for coordinating ammunition distribution and watching for breaches in their defensive line. The siege lasted for 6 hellish hours. Waves of infected threw themselves against the resort's defenses with relentless determination, clawing at steel shutters, breaking windows on upper floors, and attempting to scale the building's stone walls. The survivors' ammunition began to run low just as they noticed something that chilled them to the bone: the infected were learning. Later waves approached differently, using the bodies of their predecessors as shields and finding weak points in the defenses that earlier groups had missed. They're adapting, Rebecca observed during a brief lull in the fighting. This isn't random behavior anymore. Something is coordinating them, making them more effective as a group. Her scientific mind was fascinated even as her survival instincts screamed danger. The implications were terrifying. If the infected could learn and coordinate, humanity's chances of survival had just dropped dramatically. The breakthrough came when a group of infected managed to tear away one of the steel shutters on the lodge's east side. Carl and Helen fought desperately to contain the breach, but more creatures poured through faster than they could be stopped. Marcus made the decision that saved them all. He triggered the sprinkler system and electrical fire suppression protocol, filling the main floor with thick foam that blinded the infected and gave the survivors a chance to fall back to more defensible positions. In the chaos of the retreat, Helen Rodriguez was cornered by 3 infected near the main staircase. Without hesitation, she pulled the pins from 2 grenades that Carl had given her, holding them close to her chest as the creatures closed in. Her sacrifice took out not only her attackers but also collapsed part of the ceiling, blocking the main access route that the infected had been using to reach the upper floors. Tommy Patterson, Helen's de facto grandson, screamed her name as he watched her disappear in the explosion. Amy held him back from running toward the wreckage, tears streaming down both their faces as they realized they had lost the woman who had become their protector and guide. The loss hit everyone hard, but there was no time to grieve. The infected were still coming, and the survivors' position was becoming increasingly desperate. As the sun began to set, the survivors found themselves trapped on the resort's upper floors with dwindling ammunition and no clear escape route. The infected had settled into a patient siege, surrounding the building and waiting for exhaustion or hunger to force their prey into the open. Jake looked out at the sea of gray faces below and realized that their sanctuary had become their tomb. They had perhaps hours before their situation became completely hopeless, and the mountain wilderness offered no obvious path to safety. Chat controls Sonnet 4. The second night of the siege brought a deathly quiet that was somehow more terrifying than the constant moaning of the infected. Jake Martinez peered through the reinforced windows of the resort's upper floor, watching hundreds of gray figures standing motionless in the darkness below, their clouded eyes reflecting the moonlight like a sea of dead stars. They weren't attacking anymore. They were waiting, as if they understood that time was on their side. The survivors' food would run out in days, their ammunition was nearly exhausted, and exhaustion was making everyone careless and desperate. David Knox had been pacing the main conference room for hours, his carefully constructed composure finally cracking under the pressure. "There's a service tunnel that leads to the utility building about 200 yards down the mountain," he announced suddenly, spreading building schematics across the table. "I had it installed when I bought this place. It was designed as an emergency exit in case of fire or natural disaster. We could use it to reach the vehicles." Marcus Williams studied the blueprints with the skepticism of someone who had spent decades dealing with emergency situations. That tunnel would have to go right through the middle of that horde. Even if we could make it to the vehicles, they'd hear the engines and follow us. We'd be trading one death trap for another. "Not all of us," Knox replied quietly, and something in his tone made everyone in the room go still. "The tunnel can only accommodate a few people at a time, and someone would need to stay behind to create a distraction. Draw the infected away from the exit point." He was looking directly at the children as he spoke, his meaning unmistakably clear. He intended to save himself and leave the others behind. Rebecca Thompson felt her blood run cold as she realized what Knox was suggesting. "You're talking about abandoning people. These children have already lost everything and you want to leave them here to die." Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions, but Knox's expression remained unchanged. "I'm talking about survival," Knox replied with chilling matter-of-factness. "This facility cost me $40 million to build and equip. I have resources, connections, and safe houses that could preserve what's left of civilization. The greatest good for the greatest number sometimes requires difficult choices." He had already begun gathering his personal belongings, including a heavy duffel bag that clearly contained weapons and supplies he had been hoarding. Carl Washington stood up slowly from his position near the window, his weathered hands clenched into fists. "Helen Rodriguez died protecting all of us, including you, and this is how you want to honor her sacrifice. By abandoning the kids she gave her life to save." The mechanic's voice was steady, but there was violence lurking just beneath the surface. "Helen made her choice and now I'm making mine," Knox replied, shouldering his pack and moving toward a concealed panel in the conference room wall. Anyone who wants to come with me needs to decide now. The tunnel entrance is behind this panel, and I'm leaving in 5 minutes whether you're ready or not. Jake Martinez stepped between Knox and the panel, his hand resting on his sidearm. Nobody's going anywhere until we figure this out together. We're not leaving anyone behind, especially not children. The confrontation that had been building for days was finally coming to a head, and everyone in the room could feel the tension crackling like electricity before a storm. Knox's response was swift and shocking. He drew a concealed pistol and pointed it directly at Jake's chest. I didn't survive 40 years in business by letting other people make decisions for me. Stand aside, Sergeant, or I'll shoot you where you stand. His mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the ruthless sociopath that had been hiding beneath his polished exterior. The gunshot that followed came not from Knox's weapon, but from Amy Patterson's rifle. The 17-year-old had been positioned near the room's entrance, and her shot took Knox in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol skittering across the floor. That's for Helen, she said quietly, working the bolt action to chamber another round. And this is for my little brother. Knox screamed as Amy's second shot shattered his knee, dropping him to the floor in agony. You've killed us all, you stupid girl. Without me you'll never find the other safe houses, never reach the people who can actually end this nightmare. Blood was spreading across the expensive carpet as he clutched his wounded leg, his face twisted with pain and rage. Rebecca knelt beside Knox, her medical training overriding her disgust at his betrayal. The tunnel he mentioned, is it real? She asked while applying pressure to his shoulder wound. When he nodded weakly, she continued, then we use it, but we all go together. Nobody gets left behind. The evacuation took 3 hours of careful planning and nerve-wracking execution. Carl rigged explosive charges throughout the resort, designed to detonate 30 minutes after they entered the tunnel, creating a massive distraction that would draw the infected away from their escape route. Marcus and Jake took point, clearing the tunnel while Amy and Tommy helped carry Knox despite his treachery. Rebecca brought up the rear, clutching her research samples and the resort's communication equipment. The tunnel was a nightmare of claustrophobic darkness and the constant fear of cave-in, but it delivered them to the utility building as Knox had promised. The vehicles were still there, partially hidden and apparently untouched by the infected horde. As they loaded their supplies and prepared to leave, the resort exploded behind them, sending a column of fire into the night sky and drawing every infected creature for miles toward the burning ruins. Their convoy pulled away from the destruction just as the first wave of infected reached the utility building, escaping into the mountain wilderness with their lives but little else. They had lost their sanctuary, their sense of security, and their faith in human nature, but Rebecca's research had revealed something that could change everything. She had isolated the viral component that caused the transformation, and more importantly, she had identified what appeared to be natural immunity markers in the blood samples of certain survivors. Chat controls Sonnet 4. For 3 weeks, the survivors lived like ghosts in the Colorado wilderness, moving constantly to stay ahead of the infected hordes that seemed to track them with supernatural persistence. They had abandoned their vehicles after the fuel ran out, carrying only essential supplies on their backs as they followed game trails and stream beds through terrain that grew more treacherous with each passing day. Rebecca Thompson's research equipment had been reduced to a single portable microscope and a handful of blood samples that she guarded more carefully than her own life, knowing they might hold the key to humanity's survival. The discovery of the hidden settlement came by accident when Tommy Patterson, weakened by hunger and exhaustion, collapsed near what appeared to be a natural rock formation. As Amy knelt beside her younger brother, she noticed that the stones had been carefully arranged to conceal a ventilation shaft, and warm air was flowing up from somewhere deep underground. Jake Martinez immediately went on high alert, signaling for complete silence as he investigated the camouflaged entrance. "Identify yourselves," came a voice from the darkness below, female and authoritative. "State your names, how many are in your group, and whether any of you have been bitten." The speaker was clearly armed and prepared for trouble, but there was something in her tone that suggested professionalism rather than hostility. Marcus Williams stepped forward, his hands visible and empty. Marcus Williams, former emergency dispatcher from Denver. "We have 8 survivors, no infections, and we're carrying medical research that could be vital to stopping this plague. We've been running for weeks and we need help." His voice carried the exhaustion they all felt, but also the desperate hope that they might have finally found sanctuary. The woman who emerged from the concealed entrance was tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who had spent years in the outdoors. She wore military surplus clothing and carried a rifle with the easy familiarity of a trained marksman. "I'm Elena Brooks, formerly with the National Park Service. Welcome to Haven Base 7. Her eyes immediately found Rebecca's portable lab equipment. You said you're carrying medical research? Elena led them through a maze of natural caves that had been expanded and reinforced to create a substantial underground facility. Solar panels hidden among the rocks above provided power, while natural springs supplied fresh water and sophisticated air filtration systems kept the complex hidden from infected senses. Most remarkably, the facility housed nearly 40 survivors who moved about their daily routines with a sense of purpose and hope that the group hadn't seen since the outbreak began. We've been building this network for 2 months, Elena explained as she guided them through the main common area. There are 12 bases like this scattered across the Rocky Mountain region, all connected by secure radio networks and linked by courier routes that avoid infected territories. We estimate we're sheltering over 300 immune individuals, along with family members who haven't been exposed to the virus. Rebecca's head snapped up at the word, immune. You said immune individuals? You've identified natural immunity to the infection. Her scientific excitement was barely contained as Elena led them to a sophisticated medical facility that put the resort's makeshift laboratory to shame. Dr. Patricia Valdez, our chief medical officer, discovered the immunity markers about 6 weeks ago, Elena continued. Approximately 12% of the surviving population shows complete resistance to the viral pathogen. We've been actively searching for immune individuals and studying the biological mechanisms that protect them. She gestured toward a woman in her 50s who was examining blood samples under a high-powered microscope. Dr. Valdez looked up as they approached, her face lighting up when she saw Rebecca's CDC credentials. Dr. Thompson. We've been monitoring emergency frequencies and heard reports of your research before the communications networks failed. Please tell me you've made progress on viral transmission mechanisms. The two scientists immediately began comparing notes, their excitement palpable as they realized how their research complemented each other. While Rebecca dove into the medical data, Jake and Marcus learned about Haven Base's defensive capabilities and organizational structure. The network operated like a military unit, with clear command structures and coordinated missions to rescue survivors and gather intelligence about infected movements. Elena had been a park ranger before the outbreak, but her leadership skills and tactical thinking had made her the natural commander of their mountain stronghold. Carl Washington found himself in the base's engineering section, marveling at the sophisticated workshops and manufacturing capabilities they had assembled. We're not just surviving here, explained Luis Martinez, the chief engineer who shared a surname but no relation to Jake. We're rebuilding. Solar power, water purification, food production, ammunition manufacturing, everything we need to sustain a permanent settlement. Amy and Tommy were introduced to other children in the facility, the first peers they had encountered since the outbreak began. For Tommy especially, the chance to play and laugh with kids his own age began to heal psychological wounds that had been festering since they lost their parents. Amy found herself drawn to the base's communication center, where operators maintained contact with other settlements and monitored broadcasts from government remnants around the world. The most shocking revelation came during Rebecca and Dr. Valdez's research review. Not only had they identified immunity markers, but they had discovered that the virus was continuing to evolve. Recent samples from infected individuals showed genetic variations that made them more aggressive, more coordinated, and disturbingly, more intelligent than the mindless creatures they had first encountered. We're not just fighting a plague anymore, Dr. Valdez explained grimly. We're in an evolutionary arms race. The virus is adapting to overcome human defenses, both biological and technological. If we don't develop effective countermeasures soon, the infected will become too sophisticated for conventional resistance methods to contain. As the survivors settled into their first secure shelter in weeks, they realized they had found more than just safety. They had discovered a functioning resistance movement with the resources and knowledge to potentially turn the tide against the undead apocalypse. But they had also learned that their enemy was far more dangerous than they had imagined, and time was running out faster than anyone had realized. Chat controls Sonnet 4. The attack on Haven Base 7 came without warning, announced only by the sudden failure of their perimeter sensors and the horrifying sight of armed soldiers rappelling from black helicopters into their hidden valley. Elena Brooks had barely enough time to sound the alarm before the first explosions rocked the mountainside, collapsing several tunnel entrances and trapping dozens of survivors underground. These weren't infected shambling mindlessly through the wilderness. This was a coordinated military assault by organized human forces. Everyone to emergency stations. Elena shouted over the chaos, her park ranger training kicking in as she coordinated the evacuation of non-combatants to the deepest shelters. This is not a drill. We are under attack by hostile forces. The base's sophisticated defense systems, designed primarily to keep infected creatures out, were woefully inadequate against trained soldiers with modern military equipment. Jake Martinez immediately took charge of the combat response, rallying the base's defenders to strategic positions throughout the cave complex. His Marine Corps experience had taught him to recognize professional military tactics, and what he was seeing chilled him to the bone. "These guys know exactly what they're doing," he reported to Elena over the base's intercom system. "They've been watching us, learning our routines, planning this assault for weeks." The attacking force was led by Colonel William Hayes, a former Army Ranger whose unit had been conducting population consolidation operations across the Mountain West since the outbreak began. His troops wore no national insignia, but their equipment and coordination suggested significant backing from surviving government elements. Hayes himself was a tall, imposing man with the cold eyes of someone who had made peace with doing terrible things in the name of survival. "This is Colonel Hayes of the Western Regional Stability Command," his amplified voice echoed through the caves. "You are harboring immune individuals and medical research that belongs to the legitimate authority. Surrender your scientists and immune subjects for relocation to proper facilities, and the rest of you will be allowed to join our labor colonies." Rebecca Thompson and Dr. Patricia Valdez were frantically destroying their research data, knowing that their work on immunity markers and viral countermeasures could be weaponized by the wrong people. "They want to use immune individuals as test subjects," Rebecca realized with growing horror. "They're not trying to cure the infection, they're trying to control it." The first breach came through the main entrance, where Hayes's troops used shaped charges to blast through the reinforced doors. Carl Washington and his engineering team fought desperately to seal the tunnel with improvised explosive devices, but the attackers pressed forward with military precision, using smoke grenades and flashbang devices to disorient the defenders. In the medical bay, Amy Patterson found herself protecting her younger brother Tommy and the other children as gunfire echoed through the corridors. At 17, she had already seen more violence than most adults experience in a lifetime, but watching soldiers deliberately target civilians triggered a rage that transformed her from frightened teenager into fierce protector. She grabbed Dr. Valdez's emergency rifle and took position at the medical bay entrance. Marcus Williams coordinated the evacuation of critical personnel through hidden escape routes that Elena had kept secret even from most base residents. His decades of emergency dispatch experience proved invaluable in managing the chaos, directing families with children toward the back tunnels while ensuring that essential personnel could escape with their research intact. The battle raged for 3 hours through the maze of underground tunnels. Hayes's forces had superior firepower and training, but the base defenders knew the terrain and fought with the desperation of people protecting their families. Carl Washington made the ultimate sacrifice when he triggered a massive explosion that brought down an entire section of the cave system, buying time for the evacuation but trapping himself and several attackers under tons of rock. "Carl!" Amy screamed as the tunnel shook with the force of the blast, but there was no time to grieve. Hayes's troops were pushing deeper into the complex, systematically rounding up anyone they could capture. The colonel himself led the assault on the medical facilities, clearly prioritizing the capture of immune individuals and research materials over the elimination of resistance fighters. Elena Brooks made a desperate decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Rather than see the immune children captured and turned into test subjects, she triggered the base's final contingency, a series of charges that would collapse the entire upper level and create the appearance that everyone had been killed in the attack. The explosion was devastating, but it allowed the core group of survivors to escape through the deepest tunnels while Hayes's forces searched the wreckage above. Dr. Valdez didn't make it out. The elderly scientist insisted on staying behind to ensure that sensitive research data was completely destroyed, refusing to let her life's work fall into the hands of people who would use it to exploit rather than heal. Her sacrifice meant that Hayes's forces captured the base but not its most valuable secrets. The survivors who escaped, Elena, Jake, Marcus, Rebecca, Amy, Tommy, and 8 others, emerged from hidden exits miles away to find their sanctuary reduced to smoking ruins. They had lost their home, their friends, and their faith in the idea that surviving humans would naturally work together against the common threat of the infected. "We're not just fighting zombies anymore," Jake observed grimly as they watched helicopters circling the destroyed base. "We're fighting other people who think they can rebuild civilization by enslaving anyone who's immune to the virus." Rebecca clutched the single vial of experimental serum she had managed to save, a potential vaccine that could protect non-immune individuals from infection. It was all that remained of months of research, but it might be enough to change everything if they could find a way to mass-produce and distribute it before Hayes's forces found them again. As they disappeared into the wilderness once more, the survivors realized that their war had entered a new phase. They weren't just trying to survive the zombie apocalypse. They were fighting to determine what kind of world would emerge from the ashes of the old one. Chat controls Sonnet 4. 2 months after the destruction of Haven Base 7, the surviving members of Elena Brooks' network had established contact with 11 other resistance cells scattered across North America. Using ham radio networks and coded messages, they had learned that Colonel Hayes's forces controlled significant territory across multiple states, but they had also discovered something that changed everything. The other Haven bases had survived and were coordinating a massive counteroffensive against Hayes's military faction. Rebecca Thompson worked feverishly in a hidden laboratory built into an abandoned mine shaft, using primitive equipment to reverse engineer the vaccine sample she had saved from the base. Her breakthrough came when she realized that the immunity markers could be synthetically reproduced using common pharmaceutical precursors that were still available in abandoned hospitals and medical facilities. The vaccine wouldn't provide permanent immunity, but it could protect non-immune individuals for up to 6 months, long enough to make a difference in the war against both the infected and Hayes's forces. "We have a choice to make," Elena announced to the assembled survivors during a strategy meeting held in the depths of the mine. "We can take what we've learned and disappear into the wilderness, find some remote place where we can survive until this nightmare burns itself out. Or we can risk everything to deploy Rebecca's vaccine and try to save what's left of humanity." The weight of the decision hung heavy in the underground chamber, lit only by battery-powered lanterns and the glow of their radio equipment. Jake Martinez studied the intelligence reports they had gathered about Hayes's main facility, a heavily fortified complex built around a former NORAD installation in Cheyenne Mountain. Hayes has been collecting immune individuals from across the region, keeping them in what he calls protective custody, while his scientists try to weaponize their blood. "If we can hit that facility and free the prisoners, we could rescue hundreds of people and deal a crippling blow to his operation." Marcus Williams, now serving as the group's communications coordinator, had been monitoring emergency frequencies and discovered something that made their mission even more urgent. Government remnants in Washington and California are planning to declare Hayes's faction a terrorist organization and launch military strikes against his facilities. They're scheduled to begin bombing runs in 72 hours, which means all the immune prisoners will be killed along with Hayes's forces. Amy Patterson, now 18 and hardened by months of combat experience, volunteered immediately for the assault mission. "Tommy and I lost our parents to the infected, but we found a new family with all of you. If there are kids locked up in that facility, they deserve the same chance we got." Her younger brother Tommy, though only 13, had become an expert with radio equipment and insisted on joining the mission as their communications specialist. The plan they developed was audacious and desperate in equal measure. Using intelligence provided by escaped prisoners and reconnaissance from other Haven bases, they would simultaneously attack Hayes's facility while deploying Rebecca's vaccine to infected zones around major population centers. The vaccine deployment would serve as both a humanitarian mission and a distraction, forcing Hayes to divide his forces between defending his stronghold and preventing the spread of immunity among the general population. Rebecca's vaccine production had yielded enough doses to inoculate approximately 10,000 people, a tiny fraction of the surviving population, but potentially enough to establish safe zones where normal human society could begin to rebuild. The distribution network relied on volunteers from the resistance cells, many of whom would be walking into heavily infected areas with only temporary protection and no guarantee of rescue if things went wrong. The assault on the Cheyenne Mountain facility began at dawn, coordinated with vaccine deployments in Denver, Colorado Springs, and Salt Lake City. Jake led a strike team through the facility's ventilation systems while Elena's forces created diversions at multiple entrance points. The complex was a maze of reinforced tunnels and blast doors, defended by Hayes's elite troops who fought with the desperation of people who knew they were fighting for their vision of humanity's future. Deep in the facility's medical wing, they found the horror that Hayes had been hiding: dozens of immune children and adults strapped to examination tables, their blood being harvested for experiments while Hayes's scientists tried to understand and replicate their natural protection. Many of the prisoners were barely alive, kept sedated and weak to prevent escape attempts. Amy and Tommy worked together to free the prisoners while Jake's team fought their way toward Hayes's command center. The colonel himself made his final stand in the facility's main laboratory, surrounded by research data and prototype weapons derived from infected tissue. His final words before Jake's bullet ended his reign of terror were chillingly prophetic. "You think you've won something here? The infected are evolving faster than your vaccine can adapt. In 6 months, your immunity will be worthless and the real war will begin. The simultaneous vaccine deployments across the Mountain West achieved mixed results. In Denver, Rebecca personally supervised the inoculation of refugees gathered at the old sports stadium, watching as families were reunited and children played safely for the first time since the outbreak began. The temporary immunity allowed construction crews to clear infected zones and establish secure perimeters around essential infrastructure. As the dust settled from their victory over Hayes's forces, the survivors found themselves facing a new challenge: leadership of a growing movement of immune and temporarily protected humans who looked to them for guidance in rebuilding civilization. Elena established the first permanent settlement in the cleared zones around Denver, while Rebecca continued her research into permanent vaccines and treatments for infected individuals. The world would never return to what it had been before the outbreak, but for the first time since that terrible night in the Denver Emergency Center, Marcus Williams allowed himself to believe that humanity had a future. Children were laughing again, families were forming new bonds, and scattered communities were beginning to trade and communicate across the vast distances that separated them. The age of the undead was far from over, but the dawn of hope had finally begun to break across the horizon of a changed world. Chat controls Sonnet 4.